Handcuffs clamped down on Marcus Reed's wrists as Officer Bradley Miller dragged him off the street. His only crime was standing still, accused of loitering. The humiliation was public, sharp, and unjust. But what Miller never saw was the pair of FBI eyes locked on him from a black SUV, watching every reckless move he made. What happens when blind prejudice collides with a truth powerful enough to turn the tables? Hit like and share this story with others, because what unfolds next will leave you speechless. Let's begin. I remember the light first, the kind of late afternoon gold that slides down glass towers in downtown Atlanta and makes everything look softer than it really is. It didn't change the air, though. The air outside the federal building felt tight, like someone had cinched a belt around the block. I was crossing the plaza, coffee gone cold in my hand, when I noticed him, a tall black man in a plain jacket, standing near the steps, eyes on his watch, more than on the people. He wasn't pacing. He wasn't bothering anyone. He had the stillness of someone waiting for a name to appear in a doorway. There was weight in his face, a quiet kind of heaviness that made you think of long roads and long memories. Later I'd learn his name, Marcus Reed, but in that moment he was just a stranger who looked like he had someplace important to be. A patrol car slid to the curb and cut the street noise in half. Officer Bradley Miller stepped out like he owned the sidewalk, the kind of cop whose boots talk before he does. I'd seen him around before, the swagger, the way he scanned people like they were problems he'd solved already. He clocked Marcus and headed straight for him, hand resting where everyone knows a gun sits. "What are you doing here?" Miller said, voice pitched to be overheard. "This is loitering. You can't just stand around a federal building." Marcus turned his head, met the officer's eyes, and answered in a tone that didn't try to win anything. "I'm waiting for someone." No apology, no panic. Just a fact offered like a bus schedule. Something in that calm scraped against Miller, his shoulders, squared chin lifting a fraction, and the question sharpened into accusation. "Don't get clever with me. Waiting for who? Show me ID." "Hands where I can see 'em." Marcus did what he was told, hands visible, voice steady. "I have identification. I'm not causing trouble." You could feel the choice sitting there between them, diffuse or ignite. It took Miller about a breath to choose. He stepped in fast, crowding space that didn't belong to him, heat in his words that didn't belong to the moment. "I said this is loitering," he snapped, and the word came out like a verdict. "Turn around, now." Marcus's jaw tightened. Not fear, resolve. He turned. "I wish I could tell you there was a warning, a pause, anything that would make what happened next feel earned. There wasn't." Miller grabbed Marcus's wrist, slammed him into the stone wall hard enough for the sound to crack across the plaza, and wrenched his arms behind him. Metal flashed. The handcuffs clicked shut with that small, cold sound everyone recognizes, even if they've only ever heard it in movies. Only this wasn't a movie. It echoed in real air, caught in real throats. People stopped. Two office workers with badges on lanyards froze mid-conversation. A teenager near the corner lifted his phone like it weighed nothing. Someone muttered, "For standing there." Another voice, older, sanded down, said, "Don't get involved." I watched a woman reach into her purse for courage and come up with silence instead. "Got yourself a problem, huh?" Miller said, leaning in as if the microphones were hidden in Marcus's bones. "You want to play games outside a federal building, I told you." Marcus said, breath measured, "I'm waiting for someone." Miller translated that into threat. "Yeah, who? What's in your pockets? Keep talking." Marcus didn't take the bait. He didn't swing, didn't spit, didn't try to run. The only move he made was in his eyes, a quick flick past Miller's shoulder toward the street, as if checking a point on a private map. When his gaze came back, it carried the kind of patience you only see in people who know storms and how to outlast them. Traffic thinned. The evening bus sighed at a stoplight, and then almost quietly a black SUV eased to the curb across the way. Tinted windows, motor idling, nothing about it trying to be dramatic. But something in the way it settled made the hairs on my arms pay attention. Two figures sat inside, silhouettes crisp in the glass suits, dark enough to drink the light. They weren't rubbernecking. They were watching. Not the building. Not the pedestrians. Watching the arrest. Miller didn't notice. He had an audience and leaned into it. He asked the same question 3 different ways, tried on 3 different tones. Harder, hardest, like he was waiting for the moment the man in cuffs would fit his story. Marcus didn't give him that moment. He stood with his cheek against the stone, breathing through his nose, and every few seconds his gaze drifted back toward the street. The SUV didn't move. "Turn out your pockets," Miller said. "You think I don't see what you're doing?" "What am I doing?" Marcus asked. Not defiant exactly. He sounded like a man asking for a clean sentence in a book full of typos. Miller's hand went to the chain of the cuffs, giving it a quick, mean tug. "You tell me." The plaza drew in closer without anyone stepping forward. Phones were up now, little black mirrors catching the last of the day. A man in a tie said to nobody, "This is wrong." A woman in scrubs said to herself, "Keep walking," and didn't. The moment felt like a coin on its edge, spinning between two futures, and every spin sounded like the cuffs. I glanced back at the SUV. The passenger leaned forward slightly enough for the light to catch on a profile square, controlled the look of someone trained to be exactly where he was. The driver lifted a hand to his earpiece. Still no door open, still no siren. Just that steady, unblinking attention aimed directly at Officer Bradley Miller. Name Miller barked, pen scratching on a clipboard he'd produced from nowhere. "Spell it." "Marcus Reed," the man said. Miller wrote it like he was carving on a desk. "Reason for being here, I told you. I'm waiting for someone. For what purpose? To meet them. A beat. That's all." It made Miller furious the way plain truth refused to dress up for him. He shook his head, lips thinning, and said something about trespass and threats, and how people like you think rules bend if you stare at them long enough. Marcus's mouth tightened. The SUV's engine hummed. If you've ever felt a room tilt without the floor moving, you know what the plaza felt like then. Nothing outwardly changed, no new players, no fresh noise, and yet everyone sensed the balance shifting. The officer thought he held the center because he held the cuffs. He didn't see the center sliding a few yards down the curb to a pair of quiet eyes behind tinted glass. A siren finally wailed somewhere, far off, nothing to do with us, and faded. Miller guided, pushed Marcus toward the patrol car, one hand on a shoulder that had done nothing wrong. The crowd thinned by an inch, more phones following than feet. I took a step without meaning to, not closer, just less far away. "Look at me," Miller said, as if seeing were a privilege he could pass out or withhold. Marcus did. On his face you could read the kind of restraint that takes years to practice. He looked like a man counting to a number most of us can't reach. Across the street, the passenger door of the SUV cracked open an inch and stayed there, a shadow catching in the seam. A second passed. 2. The door shut again, deliberate, like a thought put back on the shelf. Whatever they were waiting for, it wasn't time yet. That was the part that stuck with me, how public the humiliation was and how private the watching felt. The injustice was loud metal orders, a body pinned to stone. The other thing, the silent measuring of a line being crossed, made no sound at all, but it was there, steady as a pulse. Miller didn't notice it. Marcus did. He tilted his head just enough to see the SUV over his shoulder, and for the first time there was something like relief in his eyes. Small, controlled, but real. He knew he wasn't alone. He knew someone was recording a version of this that didn't start with loitering and end with case closed. When the patrol car door opened and Miller guided Marcus down, the cuffs flashed again in the dying light. Phones followed. The crowd pretended it wasn't a crowd. The SUV idled patient. And I stood there, coffee cold in my hand, staring at a scene I'd tell you about later. The kind of scene that starts with a man in handcuffs and ends somewhere you don't expect. Because sometimes the quietest people on a street are the ones holding the loudest truth. Miller didn't just arrest Marcus, he made a show of it. I watched as he yanked the man down the sidewalk, one heavy hand gripping the chain of the cuffs, the other gesturing like he was leading a parade. His voice carried over the crowd, sharp and mocking. "A loiterer in front of a federal courthouse," he sneered. "You think you're clever standing here like you belong?" Every word was designed to humiliate, to cut Marcus down in front of strangers. People along the street reacted in different ways. A couple of young men in hoodies laughed, shaking their heads as though Marcus had earned this spectacle. Others pulled out their phones, recording every step like the arrest was a piece of theater they didn't want to miss. But most just lowered their eyes. They walked faster. They turned their faces away, pretending it wasn't happening. That silence, the silence of people who didn't want to get involved, was the loudest thing in the street. Marcus didn't resist. He didn't plead. He walked slowly, his long strides deliberate, his head steady. There was no panic in his face, no apology in his voice because he didn't speak at all. His silence was colder than the metal biting his wrists, and somehow it made him look stronger than if he had shouted back. It was as if he carried something inside, something heavier than Miller's insults, something he refused to let this man steal from him. The contrast was striking, one man shouting to prove control, the other silent, unbending, exposing that control for the weakness it really was. And someone else saw it too. Beside Miller walked Officer Daniel Ross, the younger cop. He kept glancing at Marcus as though trying to read a riddle written on his face. Ross was new to the force, still with that uneasy mix of eagerness and doubt. You could see his jaw working, see his hands flex like he wanted to interfere, but didn't know how. His eyes told the story. Something isn't right here. But he stayed quiet, falling into step with Miller trapped between loyalty to his partner and the knot in his own conscience. Across the street, the black SUV hadn't moved. Its windows were tinted, its engine idling low. Inside, shadows shifted with purpose. One of the men leaned forward, speaking in a low voice that never reached the crowd. If Miller knew who Marcus really was, he murmured he'd never have put those cuffs on him. That single line, though, unheard by the officer, changed the weight of the entire scene. Marcus wasn't just another man picked up for loitering. There was more here, something deeper. And suddenly, his silence wasn't just about dignity, it was about strategy. The twist had taken root, though no one on the street knew it yet. As Miller kept mocking, Marcus's mind slipped elsewhere, back into a memory that still lived raw under his skin. Years ago in the Army, he had seen one of his closest brothers in uniform, a black soldier, humiliated in front of the whole unit by a superior officer. It had been baseless, cruel, and unforgettable. Marcus remembered standing there young and burning with anger, wanting to fight back, but knowing it would destroy them both. That moment had taught him a truth he never forgot. Sometimes silence is the sharpest weapon. Sometimes restraint cuts deeper than fists ever could. Now walking in cuffs down a street full of strangers, he carried that lesson like armor. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to defend his worth. He only needed to endure to let Miller show his true face to the world. But endurance has its own kind of violence. "Look at you," Miller barked, jerking the cuffs for effect. "Big man, silent man. Where's your smart mouth now? This is what happens when you play games in front of the law." Marcus turned his head slightly, his gaze calm and cutting. He said nothing, and that silence, in front of all those recording phones, was louder than anything Miller had shouted. The crowd felt it. I felt it. One woman whispered, "Why isn't he fighting back?" Another man muttered, "He doesn't have to. Look at him." And still most stayed silent, torn between outrage and fear, unwilling to take a step closer. Ross walked a half-pace behind Miller, now his eyes fixed on Marcus as though trying to memorize every detail. The calm expression, the measured pace, the quiet dignity that clashed so violently with Miller's barking voice. Something in Ross's chest tightened. He didn't speak, but the doubt was spreading. Meanwhile, the SUV stayed still, its occupants watching with surgical focus. One hand lifted briefly to an earpiece, then dropped. They were waiting, measuring. The way predators wait for the exact moment to move. The entire street seemed to pulse with tension. Phones out, voices low. Miller shouting, "Marcus," silent Ross, torn and the FBI eyes narrowing from the curb. For Marcus, every step was déjà vu. The humiliation of his fellow soldier years ago, the helplessness of watching injustice play out under the flag they both served, it was all here again. Only now he was the one in chains. And just like then, he chose silence. He chose to let the weight of his calm expose the violence of prejudice. It worked. The longer he stayed silent, the more Miller's performance looked like desperation. The louder he shouted, the more hollow it rang against the quiet resolve of the man in his custody. The phones captured it all. The laughter of a few, the muttering of others, the sharp insults from Miller, the stillness of Marcus, the indecision of Ross. And somewhere in that crowd, I knew the moment was being recorded, not just on cameras, but in memory, because humiliation, this public, leaves scars on more than just the man wearing the cuffs. As they turned toward the station doors, Miller gave one last tug on the chain, forcing Marcus to stumble for half a step. The crowd gasped. The SUV's passenger leaned forward again, eyes narrowing. Still no intervention. Not yet. That was the hardest part, the waiting. Everyone was waiting. The crowd for the next outrage, Ross, for the courage to speak the agents, for the right time to reveal themselves, and Marcus. Marcus waited for the truth to come crashing down on this officer who thought he had won. The street held its breath as the station doors loomed. The show outside had run its course. But what waited inside would be worse, because the real theater hadn't even begun. The precinct smelled like burnt coffee and dust, the kind of air that sticks to your throat. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed, giving everything a dull gray edge. Miller shoved Marcus through the doors like a trophy. He couldn't wait to display his boots loud against the tile. "Sit," Miller barked, pressing Marcus down onto one of those hard plastic chairs that were never meant for comfort. He looked around, waiting for someone to notice. Picked him up right outside the courthouse, he bragged, his voice carrying. "Suspicious behavior. A loiterer at a federal building, probably casing the place. This one's going in my file." You could see the smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. This wasn't about duty. This was about performance, about the glow of self-importance. At his desk, Miller opened a report form and began writing. His pen scratched across the page like it was carving truth, but the words were lies. "Suspect appeared nervous," he muttered as he wrote. Kept scanning the area. Reached into his pockets repeatedly. Non-compliant, resisted, questioning, possible threat. None of it had happened. Anyone who'd seen the arrest could tell you that. Marcus had stood calm, steady, silent. But here, under the buzz of bad lights and the smell of stale coffee, Miller was building a fiction that fit his prejudice. Ross stood a few feet away, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold. He wasn't blind. He'd been right there. He knew Marcus hadn't resisted, hadn't reached into his pockets, hadn't threatened a soul. The lies burned hot in Ross's chest, but his tongue felt heavy. Miller was his senior, a man who could bury him with a word. So Ross stood there silent, his jaw tight, his pulse racing. And Marcus noticed. From his seat, Marcus lifted his eyes and locked them on Ross. He didn't speak. He hadn't spoken since the cuffs went on, but his gaze said enough. It was steady, unflinching, like a mirror Ross didn't want to look into. It was the kind of look that asked a question without moving lips. Are you going to stand with truth, or are you going to keep pretending you don't see what's happening? Ross shifted, breaking eye contact, but the weight of that silent question stayed with him. Miller, meanwhile, leaned back in his chair and laughed, tapping the pen against the paper. "Look at him," he said to no one in particular, jerking his thumb toward Marcus. "Quiet as a mouse. And the quieter he is, the guiltier he looks. Silence is an admission, isn't it?" Marcus said nothing, just folded his hands calmly in his lap. The cuffs rattled softly when he moved, the only sound he allowed himself. That stillness made Miller angrier. He wanted fear. He wanted resistance. He wanted something ugly to justify his own story. Instead, he got dignity. Ross looked between the two men and felt the walls close in. Every instinct in him screamed that this was wrong, but his body stayed rooted to the floor. Fear is a powerful thing. Fear of authority, fear of being cast out, fear of standing alone. And then something happened that made his heart thud against his ribs. Down the hallway, past the row of desks and the stack of half-broken file cabinets, a man walked by. He wasn't dressed like a cop. He wore a dark suit, crisp white shirt tie knotted perfectly. His shoes made no sound on the tile, but somehow his presence carried weight. He didn't rush. He didn't glance around. He simply walked steady, like he belonged anywhere he chose to be. As he neared the squad room, he turned his head just slightly and let his eyes rest on Miller. It wasn't a long stare, but it was enough. A hard, measured look that froze the air for a split second. Miller faltered, his smirk cracking for the briefest moment before snapping back into place. The man in the suit didn't speak. He didn't need to. After a beat, he continued down the hall and disappeared around the corner, the echo of his presence lingering in the silence he left behind. Ross caught it. He caught the look, the quiet authority, the deliberate way the man had paused just long enough to send a message. Ross's pulse jumped. He glanced at Marcus, and for a moment he swore Marcus's eyes had flickered with recognition. Just a flicker, then gone. Miller, though, laughed it off, forcing bravado back into his voice. "What's he staring at? Probably some Fed looking for a real case." He slapped the paper down on the desk. "Well, guess what? I just gave him one." But Miller didn't believe his own words. Not really. You could see it in the stiffness of his shoulders, in the way his hand trembled slightly as he picked up the pen again. That stare had rattled him more than he wanted to admit. Ross shifted again, torn between his badge and his conscience, between silence and truth. And Marcus sat calm and unmoving, as though he had all the time in the world. The precinct hummed around them, phones, ringing papers, shuffling officers moving in and out. But inside that small circle, Miller writing, lies Ross holding doubt, Marcus holding silence. The air was charged, waiting. Something larger was at play, something just out of sight, and the man in the suit was proof. I didn't know it then, but that was the moment the story began to tilt. What looked like an ordinary arrest was about to unravel into something none of us could have imagined. The circus had started, and the crowd didn't even know they were watching a show. The squad room had its usual hum phones ringing, typewriters clacking, chairs squeaking. But the moment the door opened, all of that seemed to shrink into silence. Two figures stepped inside and the air shifted as if someone had turned the temperature down a few degrees. Agent Carter Hayes and Agent Sophia Grant of the FBI. They didn't need to flash badges or announce themselves. The weight of their presence said it all. Carter, tall and broad-shouldered, carried a quiet authority that made every cop in the room straighten their back. Sophia, sharp-eyed and composed, scanned the space with the cool precision of someone trained to notice what others miss. Together they carried an invisible gravity, and the room bent toward it. Miller, halfway through scribbling on his report, looked up, his smirk returning. He leaned back in his chair like a man who'd just been handed an audience he didn't deserve. "Perfect timing," he said, voice dripping with satisfaction. "I've got a suspect you'll want to see." No one moved at first. Then Carter strode forward, each step deliberate. He picked up the report from Miller's desk without asking, flipping it open with steady hands. The room seemed to hold its breath as he read. His eyes scanned the page quickly, but his face gave nothing away, just that frozen, unreadable look that makes you wonder whether he's angry or, worse, disappointed. Miller chuckled. "You'll see everything's in order. Picked him up for loitering right outside the courthouse. Guy was acting suspicious, wouldn't answer questions, kept looking around like he was about to make a move. Classic case." Carter said nothing. He just held the paper a little higher, letting the silence stretch. His gaze flicked once toward Marcus, cuffed to the chair, then back to the report. His jaw tightened ever so slightly. Sophia stepped closer to Marcus, her expression softening for the briefest moment. She studied his face like she was searching memory against reality. There was something there, recognition flickering in her eyes. She didn't speak, but you could see it. She knew him, or at least knew of him. Marcus met her gaze calmly. His silence remained unbroken, but the steadiness in his eyes carried weight. It wasn't defiance, it was endurance layered with something deeper. Miller mistook all of this for validation. He puffed his chest, leaned forward, and gestured toward Marcus with a theatrical sweep. "That's him. That's the suspect I just apprehended. Thought he could stand around a federal building like he owned the place. But I don't play games." The words were too smug, too loud. And then Carter spoke. "We'll be following this case very closely," he said. His voice was calm, even, but it dropped into the room like a stone into deep water, and the ripples spread fast. Conversation died at the corners of the squad room. Chairs squeaked to a halt. The ordinary hum of the precinct was gone. All that remained was Carter's tone, not raised, not threatening, but heavy enough to silence a roomful of men who carried guns. Miller laughed again, but it was thinner this time. "Good. Glad to have the Bureau on board. We're all on the same side here." Carter didn't reply. He just closed the report, set it back on the desk with a slow, deliberate motion, and turned his head toward Marcus. That was when it happened. Their eyes locked. Carter's gaze sharp, Marcus's steady. For a long second, neither moved. No words passed between them, but something unspoken did. It was in the slight narrowing of Carter's eyes, the faint lift of his chin, and in the almost imperceptible nod he gave. To anyone else, it was nothing, a flicker, a gesture barely there. But for those paying attention, it was a signal, a recognition, a connection deeper than uniforms and titles. Ross caught it. Standing off to the side, he felt his pulse quicken. He didn't understand what had just happened, but he knew it mattered. Something bigger was at play, something beyond Miller's petty arrest, beyond a simple charge of loitering. Ross felt it in his bones. Marcus Reed wasn't who he appeared to be. Miller, oblivious, clapped his hands together. Well, glad we're all on the same page. This guy's not going anywhere. I'll finish the paperwork, and you'll see we've got ourselves a solid case. But no one echoed his laughter. The room had gone too still, the air too heavy. Carter and Sophia exchanged a brief glance, one so quick it might have been missed if you blinked. And Marcus, calm, restrained, silent, just sat there watching the faintest glimmer of something unreadable flickering in his eyes. For the first time since the arrest, the balance of power had shifted. Not enough for Miller to notice. Not yet. But the people who were paying attention, the agents, Ross, maybe even Marcus himself, felt it. The stage was being set for something larger, something Miller couldn't begin to imagine. And as Carter turned to leave the desk, his voice calm but resolute, the words seemed to settle into the room like a warning no one could quite name. This isn't over. The precinct went silent again. Ross's heart raced. And Marcus. He didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't speak. He didn't have to. His silence was still his strongest weapon. The secret lingered just out of reach, pulling everyone closer to the truth. The FBI had arrived, and nothing in that room would ever be the same. The precinct had returned to its usual buzz, or at least tried to. Phones rang, a copier groaned, someone laughed too loudly at a joke that wasn't funny. But beneath it all, you could feel the shift. The air still carried the weight of what had just happened when the FBI walked through those doors. Behind a closed door in a smaller office tucked off the main hall, the tone was very different. Carter stood with his back to the blinds, arms folded, his gaze locked on the floor as though it might give him answers. Sophia leaned against the edge of a desk, her eyes sharp, her voice low. "We can't let Marcus sit here too long," Carter said. His words were measured, but urgency flickered beneath them. The longer he's in custody, the greater the risk. Evidence disappears fast in this city. People vanish even faster. Sophia studied him, her brow furrowing. "You know as well as I do we can't force his hand. Marcus has to decide when to step forward. No one can do it for him. If he chooses silence, that's his shield and his burden." Carter's jaw tightened. He hated waiting. He hated knowing Marcus was cuffed outside enduring humiliation, while men like Miller gloated. But Sophia was right. Marcus Reed wasn't just a man in custody. He was a man carrying something dangerous, something that couldn't be spilled until the time was right. Out in the squad room, Miller strutted between desks like he was leading a parade. His voice boomed above the din, bragging about how the FBI was backing his arrest. "See," he said, slapping the report with the flat of his hand. "Even the Bureau's watching this one. Means I was right to bring him in. Knew he was trouble the moment I saw him." A few officers nodded along, eager to be on the winning side. Most just kept their heads down, unwilling to challenge him. None dared say aloud what some were already thinking, that Miller was building a tower on sand. And Marcus. He sat in that hard chair as if it were a throne, cuffs biting his wrist but his expression unchanged. His silence stretched like a drawn bow waiting for the string to release. His eyes were steady, distant, as though he wasn't staring at the dingy walls of a precinct, but at some horizon only he could see. He was waiting. Ross lingered nearby, the weight of it pressing on him harder than he wanted to admit. He leaned against a file cabinet, arms crossed, pretending to watch nothing in particular. But every time he glanced back at Marcus, shame prickled sharp in his chest. He'd seen Miller's lies firsthand. He'd watched him twist the truth into something unrecognizable. And Ross had said nothing. He'd kept his mouth shut, let the lies stand, because fear had him by the throat. Fear of being outcast, fear of losing his badge, fear of standing alone against a man who could crush him with one accusation. But Marcus's silence didn't let him rest. Every time their eyes met, even for a second, Ross felt the sting of a question he couldn't escape. "What are you doing? What side are you really on?" He shifted, his weight, heart pounding faster than it should. He wanted to speak, to call Miller out, to say something that mattered. But the words caught in his throat and died there. Out of sight in that small office, Carter closed the blinds and turned back to Sophia. His voice dropped. He knows what's coming. He's waiting for Miller to cross one line too many. When it happens, that's when he'll strike. Sophia nodded slowly. And when he does, it won't just shake this precinct. It'll shake the whole city. Back in the squad room, Miller laughed loudly at his own joke, the sound grating against the tension. "You see this guy, quiet as a stone. But quiet men always crack first. Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. His silence wasn't cracking, it was hardening. And though Miller couldn't see it, everyone else could feel it. That silence wasn't emptiness. It was warning. The kind of warning that makes you hold your breath because you know when it breaks, it's going to be loud. Ross swallowed hard, his shame deepening. He realized then what Marcus was doing. He wasn't waiting for freedom. He wasn't waiting for sympathy. He was waiting for the truth to land with the weight of a hammer. And Ross, in his silence, was standing on the wrong side of that hammer. The room carried on as though nothing had changed. Phones, papers, small talk. But those who were paying attention, the FBI behind the blinds, Ross, by the file cabinet, even the bystanders who'd stopped talking when Miller bragged too loudly, knew something was building. The silence wasn't going to last forever. It was a fuse. And it was burning. The room had been a circus of noise phones, ringing chairs, scraping Miller's voice booming above it all. But then Carter Hayes stood. He didn't slam his hands on the desk. He didn't raise his voice. He simply rose to his full height, report in hand, and spoke in a tone that carried more weight than shouting ever could. Marcus Reed Carter said, his words sharp and deliberate, is not a suspect. He is a federal witness, the key witness in an ongoing corruption investigation. The words dropped like a gavel. For a moment, no one moved. You could feel the silence stretch thick and heavy as though the entire squad room had been punched in the chest. Papers stilled midair. A pen rolled off a desk and clattered to the floor, too loud in the stillness. Miller blinked once, twice. His smirk collapsed into disbelief. What his voice cracked as though the word itself had betrayed him. No, that's impossible. He was loitering, just standing there like he didn't belong. That's all he was doing. That's all you saw. Carter replied, his gaze like steel. But what you see doesn't change who he is. Sophia Grant stepped forward, her heels striking the tile in crisp beats that sounded like a verdict. She stopped inches from Miller, her eyes cold, her voice cutting. Do you realize what you've done? You handcuffed the one man holding evidence strong enough to topple an entire network of corruption? You treated him like a criminal when he's the only thread keeping justice intact. Her words landed with precision, each one a blade. Miller staggered back half a step, his mouth opening and closing, searching for footing. That's ridiculous, he snapped, but the desperation in his voice betrayed him. He's nobody, just some man wandering around outside the courthouse. Carter's eyes hardened. His voice stayed calm, but his calm was worse than anger. You don't know him, Miller. I do. He paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough for everyone to lean in. Years ago, when I served in uniform, Marcus Reed pulled me out of a firefight. I wouldn't be standing here if it weren't for him. And today he's doing the same thing, not for me, not for you, but for this entire country. The room tilted then. The weight shifted, and Miller felt it. His shoulders squared, but the swagger was gone. All eyes turned to Marcus. He sat still, cuffed to that chair, but the room no longer saw him as a man under arrest. His silence had been power before, but now it was revelation. Marcus lowered his head, the cuffs rattling softly as he exhaled. For a moment he looked tired of carrying the same burden, tired of injustice circling him like wolves. In his silence was something heavier now, the weight of every time he'd been treated like less, every time he'd been forced to endure. He almost let it go. You could see it in the slump of his shoulders, the way his breath trembled against the stale air. He almost gave up, not on his case, not on the FBI, but on the belief that standing tall against injustice was still worth it. And then his eyes found Ross. The young officer stood near the wall, pale fists clenched at his sides. He looked torn, ashamed of his silence, desperate for courage he didn't yet have. And Marcus saw it. He saw the battle waging in the young man's chest. And in that moment, Marcus remembered why he was here. He straightened, lifting his head, the strength returning to his frame. His voice, when it finally came, was low, but carried through the room like thunder rolling across a plain. Your prejudice, Marcus said, his eyes fixed on Miller, is more dangerous than the criminals you claim to fight. The words struck hard, not shouted, not dramatic, just truth spoken plain enough to tear the air open. The squad room erupted not in noise, but in the silence that followed. A silence charged with realization, with shame, with the sudden clarity that everything had changed. Miller stumbled, his face flushing red. "You," he started, but the word caught in his throat. He had no ground left. His lies crumbled under the weight of Carter's testimony, Sophia's blade-like words, and Marcus's unshakable truth. Ross felt his chest tighten. He wanted to speak, to add his voice, but he couldn't. Not yet. Instead, he swallowed the lump in his throat and let Marcus's words echo in his bones. Carter broke the silence. "From this moment forward," he said steady and clear, "Marcus Reed is under federal protection. Any attempt to undermine him, to silence him, will be seen for what it is: obstruction of justice." His gaze swept the room, pinning every officer in place. And we all know what that means. Miller's face twisted, caught between fury and fear. He opened his mouth, but nothing came. His authority had drained out of him, his swagger collapsing under the truth now exposed. The balance of power had flipped completely. Where Miller had once paraded Marcus as a criminal, now it was Miller who stood cornered. Where laughter had once followed his words, now the room looked at him with quiet contempt. And Marcus silent, patient. Marcus sat taller in that chair than Miller had ever stood. It was the kind of reversal that makes your chest tighten with satisfaction, even as your throat aches. Because yes, it was justice in motion, but it was also painful to see how close injustice had come to winning. The cuffs on Marcus's wrists glinted under the fluorescent lights, a cruel reminder of how easily the truth can be shackled. But his words still hung in the air, louder than the metal that bound him. Prejudice was the real crime, and everyone in that room knew it now. For the first time since the arrest, Marcus had spoken, and the truth was louder than the lies that had chained him. The room would never see him the same again, and neither would Ross. The squad room still hummed with shock after Carter's revelation. The words were out now. Marcus Reed wasn't a suspect. He was the witness, the only witness holding the thread that could unravel a web of corruption. Carter didn't let the silence stretch too long. He turned to the room, his voice steady, measured, the kind of voice that didn't need to shout to be heard. "Marcus has been working with us," Carter said, "for months. He's risked everything to expose a ring of corruption that runs through this city, from street-level enforcers to local officials sitting in comfortable offices. He isn't the problem. He's the answer we've been waiting for." The words landed like stones dropped into still water. The ripples moved fast. Some of the officers looked down at their desks. Others glanced at Miller with a mix of unease and disbelief. Ross's eyes widened. The weight of his own silence pressed even heavier on him now. He hadn't just stood by while an innocent man was humiliated. He had stood by while the most important witness in a federal case was shackled. Shame burned through him like fire. Carter continued, his gaze sweeping across the room. Marcus was waiting in front of that courthouse because his contact, a federal liaison, was supposed to deliver key evidence. Files that tie city officials, business leaders, and even law enforcement to a bribery scheme big enough to cripple the trust of this city. The room shifted, whispers breaking out like sparks. Carter didn't stop. But if Marcus had been dragged into a cell, if he'd been processed like some loiterer, that evidence would have vanished. And with it, our case. Months of work, years of corruption, buried in a single act of prejudice. Miller shook his head violently, his voice shaking now with desperation. "You expect us to believe this? He's just some guy standing around outside and suddenly he's a hero. No, he's not. He's nothing." That's when Marcus lifted his head, his eyes calm and steady, locked onto Miller. He didn't raise his voice, but the entire room seemed to lean forward to catch his words. "I stood outside that courthouse," Marcus said, his voice low and unyielding, "because I was waiting to protect this country in the only way I still can. I put myself at risk to make sure the evidence reached the right hands." He paused, the cuffs on his wrists rattling softly as he shifted. His gaze didn't waver. "And you," he said, his voice cutting sharp now, "chose to put me in chains." The words hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. The room was silent, the kind of silence that makes your skin prickle. Even the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to fade. Miller's mouth opened, but nothing came out. His bravado, his swagger, his endless noise, it was gone. All that remained was the sound of Marcus's truth echoing against the walls. Sophia stepped closer, her tone precise. "Every moment you kept him cuffed, every false word you wrote in that report, you were playing into the very corruption we're trying to end. You were doing their job for them." Ross swallowed hard, shame settling deeper into his chest. He wanted to speak, to admit what he had seen, but his courage still failed him. For now he stood in the shadows, the weight of Marcus's words heavy on his conscience. Carter placed the report back on the desk, his eyes drilling into Miller. This isn't about your pride. This isn't about your record. This is about a case that could change the future of this city, and you nearly destroyed it with your arrogance. Then Carter turned to Marcus, and for the first time since he'd walked into the room, there was something softer in his eyes. Respect, gratitude, a recognition that went beyond ranks and titles. Marcus nodded, once the exhaustion in his face plain, but his resolve steady. He had nearly broken. Nearly. But not today. The rest of the squad room sat in heavy silence, the truth pressing down on them. The message was clear. This wasn't just about one officer's prejudice or one man's endurance. It was about a city on the edge, a justice system straining under corruption, and the cost one man was willing to pay to hold it all together. And in that silence, I felt it too, the chill of realization, the sting of truth. This wasn't just Marcus's fight, it was ours. Because the price of prejudice wasn't just humiliation, it was the collapse of justice itself. And that was the real danger. The squad room felt like a courtroom, without benches, without robes, without a jury. The only gavel was truth itself, hanging heavy in the air. Sophia Grant stepped forward, her eyes fixed on Miller, with a stare sharp enough to slice through steel. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The calm precision of her tone was harder than any shout. You think the law is a weapon, she asked, her words steady and direct. Something you can swing like a club to humiliate whoever you want. Or is it a mirror one that forces you to face yourself when you've crossed the line? The room went still. Every word hit Miller like a strike he couldn't block. His lips parted, but no sound came out. His face, once puffed with arrogance, now looked pale and brittle. Marcus, still seated in his cuffs, lifted his gaze. His voice came quiet but carried with the weight of stone. The law doesn't need me to prove anything, he said. It doesn't bend to my silence or your noise. What it needs is for you to finally look at yourself. The words weren't long, they weren't flowery, but they landed harder than fists. Ross stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked at Marcus and realized something that would stay with him forever. Justice wasn't about shouting the loudest or swinging the hardest. It was about endurance, about standing firm when lies pressed down, about meeting hatred with dignity so unshakable that it exposed itself for what it truly was. He felt shame burn in him again, but this time it was mixed with something else, something sharper. Resolve. Miller tried to speak, tried to conjure the swagger that had carried him this far. You don't know what you're talking about, he muttered, his voice unsteady. I followed procedure. But the words shook. His hands trembled at his sides. His confidence, once a fortress, now crumbled brick by brick. And then Carter Hayes, who had stood silent for long enough, finally moved. He stepped closer to the center of the room, his presence commanding without effort. He looked at Miller not with rage, but with a cold, final clarity. Do you know what arrogance buys you, Officer Miller? Carter asked softly. Exposure. He pulled a slim device from his jacket pocket and pressed a button. A small screen flickered to life, projecting an image onto the wall. The grainy footage sharpened, revealing the very scene that had unfolded just outside the courthouse. The sound came first, Miller's voice loud and sneering. This is loitering. Turn around. Now. Then the images followed Miller, shoving Marcus against the wall, yanking his arms, snapping the cuffs. Marcus silent, still dignified. The crowd gathering, phones raised. Every insult Miller threw, every ounce of prejudice captured frame by frame. The room gasped, a collective inhale of disbelief and disgust. Even the officers who had tried to stay neutral now shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some lowering their eyes, others staring at Miller with open contempt. Ross felt his chest tighten. He had seen it with his own eyes, but watching it replayed, objective, undeniable, was different. It was no longer a memory that could be twisted. It was evidence. Sophia's voice cut through the silence. We recorded the entire thing. Every word, every gesture, every abuse of authority. She paused, letting the footage loop once more, the sound of the cuffs echoing in the room like a verdict being read aloud. You wanted to write your story, Officer Miller. Now the truth has written it for you. Miller's face drained of color. He opened his mouth, but no defense came. The footage was a mirror he couldn't escape. His lies were stripped away, his arrogance shredded by the very truth he had tried to bury. The squad room was silent again, but this time it was a silence filled with satisfaction. Justice hadn't come from a courtroom or a judge's gavel. It had come from truth standing naked in the light, undeniable and absolute. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his eyes steady on Miller. His silence wasn't armor, now it was victory. Ross, watching, felt the shift inside him solidify. He realized that in this moment, Marcus had already won. Not because he shouted, not because he fought, but because he had endured, and in enduring, he had revealed the rot for everyone to see. And the FBI, they hadn't just brought words, they had brought proof. Proof that no amount of swagger or falsified reports could erase. The room seemed to exhale as Carter shut off the device. The screen went black, but the image lingered in everyone's mind. Miller, not Marcus, was the guilty one. For once, Miller had no performance left, no laughter, no words, only silence. And in that silence, the verdict was already clear. No court was needed. The truth had spoken. The room didn't breathe until Carter spoke again. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply stepped forward, badge visible, and issued the kind of sentence that doesn't require a robe. Officer Bradley Miller, he said, you are under internal investigation for abuse of authority and discriminatory conduct. Effective immediately, you're relieved of duty pending review. No one clapped, no one cheered. The words landed heavier than that. Miller's mouth opened, then shut. His hand drifted to the edge of the desk as if the furniture could keep him standing. The swagger was gone. Only the outline of it remained like chalk after rain. Across the room, Ross inhaled one long, deliberate breath, the kind you take before stepping into cold water. Shame had been living in his chest all afternoon. It had a name now. He looked from the dark screen on the wall to Marcus, still seated, still cuffed, still impossibly calm. A thought struck him with the force of a confession. Silence makes the wrong thing stronger. He moved, not fast, not dramatic, just steady. He crossed the floor past the scattered papers, past the stares that pretended not to stare, and stopped beside Marcus. For a heartbeat, he said nothing. Then he reached for the key on his belt. Metal touched metal. The cuffs rattled a small, tired sound that had worked too hard today. Miller lurched forward. "Hey, Ross, don't you enough," Ross said, and the word surprised even him. It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. It carried the weight of everything he hadn't said. He slid the key into the lock. The first cuff clicked open, leaving a pale band on Marcus's wrist. The second followed the sound, soft but final. A hush fell over the room, the kind of hush that remembers itself for years. For a moment, no one moved. Marcus flexed his hands, slow, careful, as if returning to a language his body once spoke fluently. He rose to his feet. No flourish, no victory pose. Just a man standing, because standing is what a man does when the truth finally has a place to land. Ross stepped back, his throat tight. He met Marcus's eyes. "I should have spoken sooner," he said, scarcely above a whisper. Marcus held his gaze, something like mercy passing between them. "You spoke now," he answered. "Make it count." Across the room, Miller sagged into a chair. The lights above him flickered, a thin pulse of electricity that made the shadows jump. He stared at his hands like they belonged to someone else. A pen rolled from his desk, tapped once on the tile, and didn't bounce. The sound was small and clean, like a gavel that doesn't need ceremony. Sophia didn't gloat. Carter didn't either. Justice has its own weather, and in that room it felt like clear air after a storm, sharp, honest, a little colder than before. Officers who had been stone-faced now looked at the floor. A couple straightened their shoulders as if deciding what kind of cop they wanted to be when the shift ended. Marcus turned toward Miller. No anger lived on his face, only a tired disappointment that reached further than the room, further than the day. "I stood outside that building to protect something bigger than me," he said quietly. "You chose to protect your pride." Miller didn't answer. Pride is loud until it has to listen. Ross found his voice again. He addressed the room, but it felt like he was also speaking to himself. "From this point on," he said, "my report reflects what actually happened. A beat, all of it." Carter gave a single nod. "That's how it starts." Marcus looked to the door. The way out had always been simple, just harder than it should have been. He gathered nothing. He had nothing to gather. When he passed Ross, he offered a slight grateful incline of the head. When he passed Miller, he paused half a breath as if laying down a weight he refused to carry any longer. Then he moved on. The room exhaled with him. Behind Miller sat alone. The flicker above his desk stuttered again, the light thinning and thickening, as if even the ceiling was undecided about him. He reached for the fallen pen and missed. It lay there beside his chair, quiet as a verdict. We didn't cheer. We didn't need to. Sometimes satisfaction is not a shout, but a loosening in the chest, a sense that the floor has stopped tilting. The damage was real. So was the repair. Marcus didn't look back. Carter and Sophia fell in step a few paces behind Guardians without ceremony. Ross stayed where he was, watching the door close on the man he'd nearly failed, and on the version of himself he refused to be tomorrow. That's how the price of arrogance was paid that day, not with noise, not with spectacle, but with a single clean click of a key, a man standing free and another man left alone with the echo of his own choices. We stepped out into night that smelled like rain, the kind that sits on the air before a storm decides what it wants to be. The precinct behind us still hummed with fluorescent light and paperwork, but the street felt wider, calmer, like the city had loosened its jaw. Marcus went first. No escort, no fanfare. Just a man with wrists newly light and shoulders carrying less than they did an hour ago. The wind rolled down the block and tugged at his jacket, the same jacket he'd worn when a crowd watched him get pressed to a wall. He paused at the top of the steps, letting the cool air meet his face. Then he walked. He didn't hurry. He didn't look for cameras or search for an audience. His stride said what needed saying, "I'm still here." A city bus sighed at the corner brakes, whispering. Somewhere, a siren threaded the distance and kept going. The world resumed itself, but different. I watched him pass the spot where earlier his dignity had been turned into a spectacle. The plaza seemed to remember. Even the stone looked softer, as if heat had bled out of it. A couple crossed the sidewalk hand in hand. The woman glanced up, a recognition flickering across her face. She didn't lift her phone. She just nodded once, a quiet salute, and kept walking. Marcus didn't glance back. Not at the building, not at the officers in the glass, not at the door that had swallowed him and spat him out with nothing added and something taken. He just offered the smallest smile, one of those private, thin smiles that belong to a man who knows what almost happened and what did not. His eyes were already elsewhere, fixed beyond the block, beyond the night. It wasn't triumph, it was release. Behind me, Carter and Sophia stepped into the dark like people who didn't need it to announce them. Carter's coat moved with the wind. Sophia's gaze stayed on the street, measuring shadows for leftover danger. Ross hovered a few feet away, still inside the doorway's frame, as if the threshold itself wanted a moment with him before letting him go. Carter turned to him. The porch light cut a line across his face, and when he spoke, he kept his voice low enough to belong to the night. The right silence at the right time, he said, can be stronger than 1,000 accusations. Ross held the words like something warm in cold hands. He nodded once, not to please Carter, but because he'd felt the truth of it in his bones, felt it when he turned a key and a room went quiet. We made the short walk to the curb. The black SUV was there, patient as ever, engine a steady breath. Its presence no longer felt ominous. It felt like steadiness made into steel and glass. The rear door opened with a soft click that sounded nothing like handcuffs. Marcus paused before he got in and looked past all of us, past the courthouse dome, catching a thin sliver of moon past the windows where people stayed late to finish things that never finish. Maybe he saw the road ahead, the way soldiers see maps, others camp routes. No one knows their traveling dangers. You learn to count by feel. Maybe he just saw the face of a man he once saved and had saved again today without pulling anyone from fire. Sophia said, "We'll take it from here." It wasn't reassurance. It was a promise made in plain language. Marcus gave a small nod. "I know." Carter opened his mouth, then closed it with a breath. There are moments for speeches and moments for standing witness. He chose witness. Ross stepped forward like the ground had yielded him permission. "Sir," he said to Marcus, and the word didn't sound like rank, "I'll make sure the report is right." Marcus studied him for a beat that stretched just long enough to matter. Then make sure the next one is right too, he said. That's how it holds. Ross swallowed as if the sentence was heavier than it looked. Yes, sir. Marcus got into the SUV. The interior light glowed for a second, turning his profile into lines clean as ink. Then the door thudded shut, gentle and final. Through the glass, he looked straight ahead, hands loose on his knees, no chains, no visible weight. The car eased from the curb and slid into traffic, like any other vehicle, like this was any other night. It wasn't. But the city doesn't always mark its own turning points with brass bands. We stood there for a while, not speaking. The wind worried a discarded receipt down the gutter, tiny paper doing a slow, stubborn dance. Carter put his hands in his pockets. Sophia checked the street with one last sweep. Satisfied, she let her shoulders drop a fraction. Inside the precinct, the door opened and closed twice, the sound of a place trying to pretend it hadn't been changed by what it had housed. Ross finally stepped out from the doorway fully and joined us on the sidewalk. He looked younger than he had inside, which is a thing that happens when a man puts down one version of himself and picks up another. I should have said something sooner, he said, not to anyone in particular. You did, Sophia replied. And now you know how to do it again. No sugar, no pat on the head, just a simple instruction for the next inch of road. Carter looked down the block where the taillights had gone. Justice is quieter than people think, he said. No echo. Just pressure applied to the right place until the wrong shape gives. It wasn't wisdom for effect. It was the kind of thing people say when they've learned it the hard way. The night settled around us. Cars passed. A late train murmured under the city. Somewhere a door slam carried the tired note of someone done with their shift. I realized then what had been bothering me since the plaza anger hadn't left. It had simply found a place to sit that didn't need to break anything. I turned back to the glass. Through it, I could see Miller at his desk alone. The overhead light flickered indecisive. He reached for a pen and missed. It lay there on the tile still as a verdict no one had to read aloud. He had noise if he wanted it, but nothing to say that could change the shape of the day. Pride is a terrible roommate when silence moves in. We began to drift in different directions, Sophia to her car, Carter to a line of calls I imagined would stretch until morning. Ross back inside to start the kind of report that turns into a spine for other men to lean on. I kept my eyes on the street until the last of the bus exhaust thinned and the corners of the block gave up their shadows. Marcus didn't look back. He didn't have to. He'd left something behind that would do the looking for him, truth lodged where it needed to be, working without applause. I started walking. The night felt bigger, the air cleaner. Not fixed, nothing that old fixes in an hour, but steadier. Sometimes a story ends with glass breaking, with sirens whooping with cheers. Not this one. It ended with a door closing soft, a car pulling into the river of taillights, a city exhaling just enough to keep going. And if you'd asked me what I heard when it was over, I'd say not shouting, not victory drums, just the even rhythm of steps leaving a place they never should have been forced to enter. Because sometimes justice doesn't need to shout. It just needs to stand. And when it stands, the wrong things learn to tremble. Sometimes justice doesn't need to be loud. It only needs to stand firm, and the guilty will learn to shake. And that's where the story leaves us tonight. Marcus reminded us all that true strength isn't in shouting, it's in standing firm even when the world tries to break you. His silence spoke louder than any argument, and justice found its way without noise. If this story moved you, please hit the like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And don't forget to subscribe to Mr. Max Stories for more powerful, meaningful stories like this one. Your support means the world. It's what gives our team the drive to keep creating heartfelt stories that matter. Remember this, Mr. Max Stories isn't just a channel, it's a place where justice speaks even in silence.